Hey, APUSHers. So I hope everybody's safe and healthy. So we're starting period 3, and this is going to be frame 3 and this is going to be actually begin Washington's administration. Last we left, remember that there was the ratification race for the passage of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and with the assumption of the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, being added to the Constitution, there was enough support for ratification that the Constitution will pass. And then the first elections took place in 1789. George Washington is going to be elected first president unanimously, with John Adams becoming the vice president. He's going to be inaugurated in April, and our creation of a republic will commence. So, despite the fact that the War of Independence between the United States and Britain was over, that did not mean that our relationship with the British ended. Uh, there's going to continue to be British presence in now the United States. There's going to continue to be tension. As a matter of fact, the British just assumed we'd go back to essentially salutary neglect, where we continued to be a mercantilist economy while self-governing. And so the British didn't leave. British troops, the Redcoats, remained in this area right here in the Ohio River Valley. And as a result, tensions were going to brew. So let's talk about some of these tensions. A lot of it had to do with the minorities that existed in the United States. First up is going to be the Native Americans. So you may recall during the War of Independence, the British had enticed Native Americans to side with the British to fight against the Americans. And that was because the natives did perceive Americans as being a greater danger to them than the British. Remember, the British had attempted to stop westward expansion with the Proclamation of 1763. So the British continued to supply the western tribes here in the Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes region, with arms and ammunition in order to attack American settlers there. An example of this aiding of the British to Native American groups, an example of this, and this is just one of many, is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers was between the Western Confederacy. These are many of the western tribes in the Great Lakes region, led by a Miami native known as Little Turtle. And that's him right here. And so Little Turtle is going to raise a series of uprisings against U.S. settlers. Finally, George Washington is going to send his nickname was Mad Anthony Wayne, General Wayne, to Ohio in order to crush this uprising led by Little Turtle. The result is a violent confrontation that will lead to the natives failing. As the result of the failure of the Battle of Fallen Timbers is the Treaty of Greenville. So the Treaty of Greenville essentially gave native territory, reduced the amount of native territory, but did allow for a certain portion of territory to be protected by the British. Be protected by the federal government against Western encroachment. You can kind of see here the Greenville Treaty line. So the territory that is in purple is considered to be native territory protected by the U.S. federal government. And this would prevent further encroachment into this region. But it is a significantly smaller region than what the natives had originally. I will tell you, though, that this treaty will be disregarded by American settlers, and this is an ongoing tension between the U.S. and the natives. Adding to tensions with the British are going to be the African slaves. So you may recall that during the War of Independence, the British, in addition to recruiting Native Americans, also recruited African slaves, promising them freedom to join the British military. And so many did. The war led to some slaves to escape to join the British Army, and this created tension. Now, the idea of War of Independence was to bring about individual freedom, liberty. Now, that appealed to many African tribes, rather African slaves, and this really did bring into question the issue of slavery and whether this was a good practice in the United States or not. Even caught up in the fervor of liberty and independence, South Carolina prohibited the slave trade, and even Virginia passed a law encouraging the freeing of slaves, something known as manumission. Um, and then, so they caught up in this fervor, but many slave owners, those 12 people, they were very skeptical and remained ambivalent towards the American Revolution and the War of Independence because they didn't like that their slaves were getting this message that we should have individual freedom. And so, as a result of the War of Independence and the American Revolution, many states like South Carolina and Georgia, following the end of the War of Independence, passed even more stringent slave codes. All right, so after the war, applying to the original 13 states, right, um, every southern state but South Carolina and Georgia prohibited further importation of slaves from abroad. In those states, slave codes did intensify because if they're not going to be able to import slaves, they're going to really hold on to the slaves that they had. So slave codes and greater control intensified. By 1804, slavery was abolished in New England. And what this is going to lead to is regional differences, regional identities. The South largely intensifying slave codes, and the North eliminating slavery as an institution. And the famous quote you may remember from Thomas Jefferson is, "Slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears." Now, women. So, following the American War of Independence, the role of women is going to be changed and then also stay the same in some regards. So, for instance, women did not receive any greater rights as a result of the War of Independence and this talk of liberty, and they were largely excluded from not only Articles of Confederation but also from the U.S. Constitution. Even Abigail Adams, the wife to John Adams, when John was going to the Constitutional Convention, told her husband, "Remember the ladies, include women in this Constitution," but that didn't happen. So legally, nothing changed for women following the War of Independence. So what did change? Well, as we are creating a U.S. governmental structure with the ideals that this republic will embrace. Remember the Republican ideology that involved enlightened citizenry, an active, responsible, enlightened citizenry. There was a move towards publicly educating Americans. Now, because those institutions and that infrastructure was not there yet, I mean, they're moving in the direction. Remember the Northwest Ordinance set aside land sale for public education, but those infrastructures aren't in place yet. So who's going to be teaching our kids to become virtuous citizens? Well, moms. So the Republican motherhood emphasized extending education to women to the extent that they can then educate their children to be virtuous citizens in this new republic. All right. So, last but not least, let's talk about, in addition to public education, religious liberty. So, you may recall the Northwest Ordinance did allow for complete religious freedom in those northwestern states. Realize this is also creating regional differences. In the North, the Northwest Ordinance is not only providing for public education, no slavery, and religious freedom. The South really didn't do that to the same extent, creating these differences. However, religious liberty is starting to become a prominent topic, and even Virginia, largely because of Thomas Jefferson, enacted the Statute of Religious Liberty, which called for a separation of church and state, and added to the First Amendment to the Constitution. Remember, this is all having relatively simultaneously, is the idea of establishing religious freedom in the First Amendment. All right. So as we create this new republic, right, under the U.S. Constitution, one of the most important things in creating stability and sustainability in a democracy is having a strong economy. So Alexander Hamilton is going to propose a plan, his financial plan, in order to establish a strong and stable economy. So the first part, it was I like to call it a four-part plan, and so the plan first part is funding the debt. So this meant that during the War of Independence, in order to raise revenue, the Confederation had raised money through selling certificates of indebtedness. Think of them like war bonds. So you bought this war bond, and that money went towards the war cause. And so during the course of the war, and everyone did their civic duty, and they purchased these certificates of indebtedness, otherwise known as war bonds. And so when the U.S. Constitution was written, of course, the old Congress, the Continental Congress, or the Confederation, was no longer in existence. So the big question is, are the certificates of indebtedness still good? Alexander Hamilton proposed that yes, they would be still good if you, as the holder of the certificate of indebtedness, went to the new U.S. government and exchanged them for interest bearing bonds. So the government would pay interest to the bondholder uh, for this exchange. So here's the dilemma. And everybody agreed, yes, let's exchange them. Let's not leave people out in the cold. Let's exchange them. And in so doing, we get a credit history. So this is a good thing. So the problem was that during the course of the war, many bondholders, because times were tough, the economy was fragile, sold their war bonds, their certificates of indebtedness to people with money, so the elite, and for a fraction of their original price. So holders, the current holders of the certificates of indebtedness, were the elite. Hamilton says, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. We want to give those people a vested interest in the sustainability and survivability and success of the U.S. government. The rich will now be personally invested in the success of the U.S. government. But Madison and Jefferson were like, wait, that's not fair. This is a country of the people, for the people, by the people, and the people are common. And so maybe, we should give it to the original bondholder. At the end of the day, Hamilton is going to win out, and the U.S. interest-bearing bonds will go to the current bondholder. So immediately we're thinking, is this republic going to be made for the elite or for the common man? Assuming state debt. So a brand new country, days old, of course, has no credit. And so in order to establish credit, you need to take out a loan. Well, no one's going to give the U.S. government a loan. So Hamilton proposed assuming the state's debt. We will take on their debt and pay it so that we would establish a credit history. Um, and this is a good thing. We want revolving debt cycle. We want to be able to take out loans, pay them down, take out more loans, pay them down, establishing lines of credit. This made it so that if we needed money in a hurry for any reason, due to an emergency, we can quickly take it out. In order to get this passed, this part of his plan passed, Hamilton needed Jefferson's Virginia vote. And so Thomas Jefferson is like, well, Virginia doesn't have any state debt, so this wouldn't be helping us any. Why should I give you my vote? And so Hamilton's like, all right, name your price. What is it that you need in order to get Virginia's vote? And Jefferson, again concerned that the country was being created for the elite and for the Northeast, said, let's move the U.S. capital down to the South. And so we have what is known as the Assumption Bill. And this basically established Washington, D.C. as the U.S. capital in the South. All right. The third part of Hamilton's plan was the creation of a national bank. And again, we know nothing about banking, so this would be a bank that's already in existence, most likely in the Northeast, because that's where the center of banking was. And this national bank would provide loans and currency to business. It would be a safe place to deposit federal funds, and this would be a place to store, right, deposit all collected taxes and to disperse government expenditures. So the fact that it was an already existing private bank again leads to the conclusion by Jefferson and what are growing Democrat Republicans that this country is just making the rich richer and benefiting the rich. So there was a lot of debate over this. Jefferson and Madison argued, well, there is no U.S. bank strictly enumerated into the Constitution, therefore it is unconstitutional. Hamilton's going to argue, well, it's implied because we do need to disperse funds and that kind of thing, so it is an implied power. So at the end of the day, there was a compromise. The Bank of the United States, as Hamilton saw it, will begin operating, but only under a 20-year charter, which would mean that it will expire in 20 years. So since it began operating in 1791, in 1801 is going to be when, no, 1811, sorry, did the math wrong. 1811 will be when the National Bank will be set to expire. The last part of Hamilton's plan is going to be to generate revenue. How can we raise money? So Hamilton proposed two new taxes and a monetary system to generate revenue. The two taxes are an excise tax. An excise tax is a tax placed on a specific manufactured product. In this case, it's going to be whiskey. So an excise tax on whiskey. And that, of course, is going to upset many of the farmers because whiskey is made from wheat and other types of oats grown by farmers, and so many farmers were also whiskey distillers. So this is really going to upset our farmers, and they're going to take to their pitchforks again. The second tax is a tariff. This is a protectionist type of tax. Remember, when I say tariffs, you say stimulate domestic industry. And at this point in time, perhaps you could argue that there was a need to stimulate domestic industry. Let's start having more U.S. industry being encouraged and supported by the government by a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. So there would be no competition really from outside of the United States. So with these two tax measures, plus the Coinage Act of 1792, which coined the dollar, backed by silver. So we're going to have a currency that will be backed by silver. With the passage of these three things, we'll see that the Hamilton's financial plan will be complete. Now, the passage of this tax is going to upset the farmers, and we're going to see the Whiskey Rebellion as a result. And these yeoman independent farmers are starting to grow skeptical and suspicious of the Federalists and what is a Federalist program that seems to be benefiting the elite and not the common man. All right, so what's going to happen with these Whiskey Rebellion? Well, the farmers are going to take to their pitchforks and they're going to start wielding them. And this is not going to be a Shays Rebellion. Remember Shays Rebellion, the elite had to raise their own military under the Articles of Confederation. But here we have George Washington, and the U.S. military is going to raise the U.S. Army, and they're going to go after our pitchfork-wielding farmers, and they will crush them. So the Whiskey Rebellion is going to demonstrate the power and strength of the U.S. Constitution. All right, let's go ahead and stop there, and we'll pick it up with main idea C next video.